And my next guest is here in studio with me. And his name is Wes Merritt. He is the president of Merritt Insurance Services. He's been working with doctors and specializing in medical malpractice insurance for over 20 years. In his career, he's been an underwriter, a reinsurance intermediary, and president of a malpractice insurance company, and a senior vice president of one of the largest insurance brokerages in the world. His experiences led him to the creation of Merritt Insurance Services, and he can be reached at 516-946-7388, and he's got more contact information that you can find on our my playlist on our website. So, Wes, good afternoon. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. I'm so glad that you were able to come on the air today and talk to me about, and the audience, about malpractice. And why don't you start first by giving us a little background? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
Okay. I grew up, initially grew up in Queens and moved out to Huntington while going to high school in Garden City all along that time frame. And then when I graduated high school, I came to Stony Brook for a year. So I spent some time as a student at Stony Brook. I played lacrosse here for a year and enjoyed my time. And this is my first time actually back in buildings.
So that's why you didn't get lost. Most people have a little trouble finding the studio, and you were spot on time.
It's a little different than it was in 1990, but yeah, I found my way.
So, and now you are involved with medical malpractice. And what I'd like to do is start by talking a little bit about malpractice insurance, because I think people are familiar with the concept. But I know for myself, other than that broad concept, I really don't know much about it. So can you explain a little bit about what it is, why it's needed, and who needs it?
Sure. Okay. So the basic understanding of medical malpractice is essentially, when a doctor practices, they get insurance so that if they do something to a patient that results in an injury or something that goes against the typical practice that a doctor should have done, what'll happen is this malpractice insurance would protect them if they get sued for that situation. That's the basic overview. And
it doesn't just pay out any awards. It take care of the whole process?
It does. So whether or not a doctor is going to get sued for a malpractice case, what the insurance is going to do, it'll protect them for the situations where even if there's a lawsuit that isn't quite doesn't have the merit that it should, that insurance is going to defend them. And in some cases, I've seen cases over the years where an insurance company may pay a few $100,000 in defense costs, and it ultimately ends up in a defense verdict where the doctor was proven to do nothing wrong. So the costs associated with not only the insurance on an individual basis to the doctor, but from a company's perspective, it can be exorbitant costs.
Right. So it's, I think a lot of times people associate malpractice just with the award, but there are so many cases that don't even get that far.
Right. That's absolutely right. And, from an insurance company's perspective, they have, hundreds of cases a year that really don't go anywhere in terms of a doctor being at fault that they're paying costs on to defend that doctor.
So how did you get involved? Insurance is such a big field. How did you narrow it down and wind up in this narrow corridor?
A lot of people in the insurance world, but in the malpractice insurance world, typically, don't go to school for it, and you just kind of happen to fall into it somehow. And in my case, I had been looking into doing either physical therapy or even going into coaching. I coached lacrosse for a while, and there was an open position at an insurance company here on Long Island. At the time, it was the second largest carrier in New York State, and it was my stepfather had said to me, Wes, your friends are graduating from college now. Do you think anybody would be interested in an office job? And at the time, the last thing I wanted was an office job. And I was given an opportunity to give it a try for a couple of weeks, which I did. And here I am 22 years later, still doing insurance. So you've just happened to fall into it typically.
It's funny because I've got a slightly similar story. I wound up going to the College of Insurance in Manhattan, and it wasn't like I had a passion for insurance or anything. And then when I got there, I wound up in the life and health division and working for Metropolitan Life, and you wind your way around and wind up where you are today.
Right, exactly.
So, all right. So now, what else can you tell us about malpractice? Like, hasn't there been quite a few changes in that industry?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, especially doctors in New York, are struggling with. And a lot of them might not even know, what the story is, and what the changes are, and how it could impact them positively. Historically, in New York State, there were really only two carriers. And generally, the doctors in the state, about 80% of the doctors in New York State were insured with one of those two carriers. Without going into details about, the state oversight and the carriers and things like that, there really were never any options for the doctors. Now, over the last several years, there have been other carriers that have come into the state where they don't necessarily have the same involvement with New York State Insurance Department, which has its pluses and its minuses. But at the end of the day, what it's done is it's brought options to the doctors, which the doctors a lot of times don't even know.
And they didn't used to have so many options?
Correct. Right.
And
so
that was just... Have there been regulatory changes? Has the nature of the business or the policies changed? What brought that upon?
There's a lot of the well-known national insurance companies that write medical malpractice insurance on a national basis never really wanted to come into the state over the years.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
New York is a really tough place to do business, and as Vanessa and I talked about earlier, it gets very entrenched.
Right.
And yeah.
So what was happening is, these carriers were writing all over the country, and to come into New York State, they had to make agreements with the state, and the state essentially oversees those rates. And the carriers say, we're doing this in every other state. We're doing well. We don't necessarily want to come into the state and have somebody telling us what to do. So it kind of kept some of that, that outside national writer focus outside of New York. So over the past several years, a couple of carriers who write on a national basis decided to come in under a certain type of company, which kind of falls below the radar of those state requirements.
Under the thresholds.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you come in and it's as a risk retention group, for example, that's a type of insurance company that doesn't fall into the oversight of an admitted carrier in the state. So they're able to come in and they're able to say, okay, well, we think an exceptionally good doctor should get a benefit on their premium, and here's why. So that's where the story starts to become much more interesting for a doctor, and why it's important for them to really take a look to see what their options are now.
So providers have more choices now than perhaps they did when 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
It probably started about 7 years ago, roughly. But over the last probably 3 years, it's really started to tick up to where these other companies have come in a short period of time. They're writing 10 to 15,000 insureds in New York State, with premium writings of upwards of $200 million. So they're large companies with large financial backings, which is a nice attention grabber to doctors.
Right.
Really
it's not
need to
like
know.
some little fly-by-night operation that isn't going to be there for them when they need it.
Right.
Especially in the litigious environment we've got here in New York.
Right. And then you still have the carriers who've been here since the 70s and early 80s. The two largest writers in the country, in the state, they're still here doing business. So the options are still there.
So the ones who have been here for a while, have they had to adjust to the newcomers in the field as well, or are they more pinned into the same old way things have always been?
Some of the day-to-day operations and the pricing, the underwriting procedures, a lot of that stuff really hasn't changed too much
For those carriers that are
right,
still here.
Right. I mean,
Interesting.
there have been changes, but because those carriers still fall under the oversight of the state, what could happen is, on an annual basis, they may go to the state and say, and I'm just going to talk in generalities and make up some numbers just to make the point. A carrier might say, well, we think we need a 30% rate increase. And another carrier might come and say, we need a 15%. And the state may review all the information that the carriers send in. And the state might come back and say, okay, well, you know what? We've reviewed all your information, but we think we're going to give both of you a 3%. So their hands get kind of tied, even though their results are showing something.
Right.
So that's what these newer carriers are able to avoid a little bit.
So what you do is you work with providers. How exactly does it work?
As a broker, the unofficial definition of a broker is, you're really an advocate for the doctor. And I have the ability, and brokers in general have the ability to work with multiple companies.
Okay, great. So so you can provide them with the different options and give them a choice.
Exactly. So, from my experience coming from, the carrier side for so many years and working on the underwriting side and knowing the ins and outs of an insurance company and how they view it, what I'm able to do is I can look at a doctor and know the rules of the individual companies in the underwriting and, look to see who's the best fit for what company. Because the rules do change. I mean, for example, a new doctor coming out of medical school, one company might give that doctor a discount over a 3-year period. Another company might do it only for a year. One might do it for a 50% discount the first year. Somebody else might do it for 57% or 58%. So the rules really are different carrier to carrier, and it's really sitting down and the doctor taking a look at their practice. And what I do is sit with them and review the practice, the hours, the procedures, really getting in there and getting down to the nitty-gritty of the practice to determine what carrier might be the best. And especially in today's world and lower reimbursements and everything else, the income going down. Now is as good a time as any to take a look at the options to look to save money.
So what are some of the different and I'm not even thinking about this from the provider side. I'm thinking about this from the layperson side, just because I find this interesting. What are some of the criteria or the different things that that would impact a rate? And do you only work with doctors or different kinds of providers?
It's typical. I'll answer the easier question first. It's typically MDs, DOs, physician surgeons.
What about NPs?
I can get coverage for NPs. A lot of times, what'll happen is you can get standalone policies for them
because they can. That is like a huge thing that happened a couple of years ago. They can stand alone now.
Exactly, and
they used to have to be connected to an MD.
Right.
With the collaborative agreement, and now they can be on their own.
Right. And that's one of the things that, the carriers evolve with. Because, if you were going to, 5 years ago, if you were going to charge an NP, let's say $1,000 for a policy, well, all of a sudden they have all these extra procedures that they're allowed to do. What you couldn't do 6 years ago. Well, 5 years ago, now you can do all these things. So in that 1 year, their potential exposure from a risk perspective, they're doing more to a patient. Potentially, that's more that can go wrong. So that premium might have jumped, up to, $3,000 or $4,000. So yes, they can get coverage, and that's one of the reasons behind why a premium would change like that, is because of the potential exposure that they have that they didn't have before.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the other criteria that might impact?
The main ones are the specialty.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so for example, an OBGYN isn't going to pay as much as a family practitioner.
Really?
And if you think about what a family practitioner does versus what an OBGYN does, if something goes wrong, something is going to go wrong in a much bigger way with an OBGYN, because you're dealing with babies.
Oh, so their rates would be higher.
Oh yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That's what I was.
Yep.
That's what
an
I was.
OBGYN could pay upwards of $200,000 a year.
Well, again, that's the whole litigious thing too, right?
That's right.
Right.
And
people have unrealistic, or people have very, very high expectations of outcomes.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, again, this goes to a much deeper level than, we have time to talk about over the next 3 weeks. But, that's the basic understanding is, there's so much more that goes into that. And, the parents are expecting a perfect child, and, doctors do screw up. It's not.
They are human beings.
Yeah, exactly. There are cases that are legitimate cases, and the doctors understand that, and the patients have to understand that. They're the kind of the stigma of a doctor's always going to screw up. If something goes wrong, it's the doctor's fault.
Right.
You really need to look at it on both sides, where a doctor should sit down with a patient, go over the risks. Get those forms signed acknowledging that you've discussed everything. So there's a whole risk management perspective that goes into the insurance. But overall, you're right. There are high expectations. And then, if something does happen with an OBGYN, while delivering a baby, it's a different perspective from not only the parent's perspective, but if it goes to court and there's a jury and there's a verdict potentially, there's a perception that the jury has as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into it, other than, I kind of look at it, if you compare your car insurance to this, you really can't, because you pay your car insurance, you get into an accident, you get the money, and everybody goes home. This is much more involved and at much more deeper levels,
right.
Because of that.
Right. I actually served on a jury in a medical case, and when you read news reports on things, I know I'm not getting always the whole story, but to have been there and seen the whole thing through, it isn't always crystal clear that the doctor did something. There's so many other factors that could be involved.
There really are. And that's, coming from my working on an insurance company side of things, obviously most of my career was spent on the carrier side. So I'm very familiar with the carrier perspective and how you look at it at a claim. The doctors have a responsibility for the treatment, as do the patients, to follow the proper guidance of their physician. Because a lot of times, that may not happen, where maybe an individual, a patient didn't do the follow-ups they should, or didn't go to those extra exams that they were supposed to go to.
It's interesting. That's actually one of the things that I often coach providers on, because I do a lot of medical coding, and one of the big things is everybody focuses on the procedure code, because the procedure code is what generates the money. But the diagnosis code tells you the whys, right? The procedure code tells you what you did for that patient, what the service was, and the diagnosis code says why. Well, there's a whole bunch of diagnosis codes for refusal, patient noncompliance, and I'm always encouraging my providers to make sure that they use those codes, because that lets everybody know that the provider isn't being negligent. They are acknowledging that the patient is not following their instructions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's one of those, like that NBC commercial, the more you know. It's the same thing. You really need to know what goes on behind the scenes to really make decisions on things.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of factors. So my guest today is Wes Merritt, and he is with the, Merritt Insurance Services, and we're talking about malpractice insurance for medical providers, and trying to understand a little bit more about what is it and who needs it and why does it cost so much, and what are some of the different options that providers might have. And Wes, people can reach you, right, if they have questions or they want to know a little bit more about this. Why don't you give out your contact information?
Sure. I can be reached by phone at 516-946-7388, or by email at Wes Merritt, WESMERRITT, at Merritt, MERRITT, INS Insurance Services. So it's Wes Merritt at Merritt INS Services.
.com.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And there's also a website, MErrittINSServices.com.
And let's just say that you didn't get all that down. You can look on my website, not on my website, on WUSB.FM, and I've got all the information captured from this program on that. On my playlist. So contact information for my guests. And with any luck, we'll have a copy of this interview up also on our YouTube channel. So you can hear it again that way. So I wanted to thank you very much for coming in. Is there anything else that you wanted to, that we didn't get to talk about?
No, I think it's a good overview. I think, and every time I meet with doctors or meet with groups and things like that, to me, just because of the environment in New York and the history of New York, it's just important for any doctors to really take those steps to really learn about what their options are. And I'd be happy to sit with anybody to get into the details. Like I said, we don't have the time now, but it's important to really understand. For a doctor to understand, what their exposures are and how that impacts their premiums.
And if they haven't done that in a while, it's probably something that makes sense to revisit, because not only has this environment changed where there's more products available in New York than there traditionally have been, but doctors' practices change too, right? Their focus changes. They bring on people. They make different partnerships. They have different staff coming and going.
Yeah, absolutely.
They change their focus of the services they provide.
Yep, and to exactly as you're just saying, one of the things that became so big over the last probably 10 to 12 years is doctors adding cosmetic procedures. Some carriers aren't really too fond of that.
Well, then that kind of gets into the baby category, right? Because I'm paying you money to do something, and if it's not perfect in my eyes, maybe something's wrong.
That's right. And then and for the most part, and I underline that, for the most part, the cosmetics, the Botox, things like that, dermabrasions, they're typically it's somebody is unhappy with the result. It's not
shocking, right?
Right.
Shocking. You're trying to go in and make alterations,
right?
And you have in your
22.
mind.
I thought I was going to come out looking 22 years old.
Yeah.
But
even like what happened with Joan Rivers, right?
Yeah.
Perfect example.
Right.
Perfect. And I think probably the opposite happens too. So I know, for example, a lot of times providers have said, you know what, the insurance companies aren't paying me anymore to do this, that, and the other thing. I'm just going to refer it out. I'm not going to do it in-house anymore. And their insurance may be charging them for the risk associated with doing those procedures.
You're 100%
So
correct.
it can go up and it can go down.
That's right. And just to follow that up, one of the things that separates the premium is the procedures that a doctor is doing. So you can be a doctor doing certain procedures that put you into a minor surgical class. Well, if you weren't doing a few of those procedures, you'd be in a no surgery class, which would result in a lower premium.
Ah, that's very interesting.
Or you could do additional things that could put you into a surgical premium class.
Interesting.
So, you with the addition or subtraction of a handful of procedures, you could be completely.
I'm thinking of the CBT codes in my head, saying, "Oh yeah."
Right. So you could be, that's when a doctor needs to make a decision: is doing these 3 procedures justifying the exposure, the additional malpractice premiums?
Yeah,
or
that's
should I cut
really
back
interesting.
and keep it at a different premium class?
That's really interesting.
So that kind of circles back to your earlier question about things that go into pricing.
Right. Well, this has been really informative, and we met at the Healthcare Introductions Networking Group, and that's a group of a bunch of different people. There's probably 60 people in the group, although when we meet, tends to be more like 20 people that can drag themselves out of bed on a Tuesday morning to get to the meeting. But there are quite a few people who you would overlap with, or what you do would come into the work that they're doing. So I tend to not get so involved in the operational and financial consulting from a non-reimbursement perspective, but there's quite a few people that that would work for you for. So we should make sure you connect with all of them.
Yep. That sounds good.
Yeah. So Wes, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely.